on YouTube because I always forget to do that. And we'll start, and then somewhere along the way, we'll take a look at the live chat and we'll answer questions. So let me just pull up the chat here. Hold on, I'm just still trying to get set up. Takes me a second. And all right, we should be live. Welcome to the podcast, Nate. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
So to give Nate a bit of an introduction here, he's currently a remote worker. He's an Android dev. He works mostly with Kotlin. I'm assuming all Kotlin probably. He's been a remote worker for how long?
A little over 3 years now.
It's a long time. And he's also worked at really big companies. He's worked in Silicon Valley. He's also a YouTuber. He's a public speaker. He does presentations. He's kind of done it all in the programming world, all the things that you could do. And I'm excited to get to know him. I think he's going to bring a lot of value to the podcast and to those of you who are listening. So thank you, Nate. I want to start by talking about your life. How did you start programming? When did you start programming? Why did you start programming?
Yeah, man, thanks for having me. So I got started programming in a roundabout way. The first programming class I ever took, or really my first exposure to programming at all, was freshman year of college, and I hated it. I did not do well in it.
It seems very common. Like a lot of people say their first sort of programming experience was not positive. I mean, mine was sort of the same, but I think it's just the way universities teach. Like it's very boring.
Yeah, it was a combination of that. Like I mean, it's kind of dry when you're in like the intro. You can't really do anything that much fun yet.
Like almost nothing.
Yeah. And it wasn't like I wasn't going into computer science. So it wasn't like a class that I had chosen to take. It was just an elective that I had to take for my degree at the time. And just being like a freshman in college, I didn't want to study as much as I needed to, honestly. So yeah, the first class did not go well. And it wasn't until 4 years later, like in my last semester at university, I took another programming class, but this one was it was geographic information systems programming. So it was actually separate from the computer science department at the school. And it was all like Python programming, and it was solving real world problems that I was actually like able to take and apply in my job at the time as like a GIS analyst for like my local public works department. And so suddenly I was able to like automate away months and months of work and just like show up to my manager, be like, hey, I did the next 6 months of work over the weekend. And like that really for me like made programming click. I was like, wow, this is amazing. I can do all this stuff. And so that kind of led me down this path of deciding to stick around for an extra semester and getting like a minor, because I thought, oh, this might be handy to have in my career as a GIS analyst. And by the time I finished that extra semester, I had decided that that's just what I wanted to do. So at that point, I was pretty much hooked on programming and was wanting to basically continue improving my skills during a semester off I had before starting grad school. I decided to get into the industry. I thought, having some degree would be useful. And I didn't really know of some of the options out there too, to like sort of bypass that. Like nowadays, I'm not sure if I would make the same decision, but at the time I decided to go back to grad school because it was faster than getting an undergrad in computer science.
Interesting.
And yeah, it's kind of weird. Like,
yeah,
at the
I
time,
understand though. Like it kind of makes sense because like an undergrad, you're bound to it for 4 years, and like a lot of it too is like not necessarily things you want to know. And if you've already got education and you can go into a master's program, that's probably a better way to go because it takes less time and you jump right into the interesting stuff.
Exactly. That was totally what I was thinking. I was going to have to spend basically 2 years doing all these different prereqs because they didn't overlap with what I had. But to go the graduate school route, I basically just got to jump right into upper level computer science classes, software engineering classes. So that was awesome. And so before I started that, I wanted to not just waste this time off. And so I decided I would pick up mobile development. At the time, this was like 2012, 2013. And so, Android and iOS were both just sort of getting off the ground. And so I went out, I remember I went out and bought, actually I bought Don Felker's Android App Development for Dummies book.
Oh yeah.
And then I ordered the Big Nerd Ranch iOS book, and I just started going through them in the evenings, like a little bit at a time. And then because of like work had some interest in possibly building like an Android app, my Android knowledge quickly outpaced my iOS knowledge. And then that just kind of never stopped. Like as soon as I got into grad school, I had opportunities to work on some projects with Android there. Actually, my graduate research, we were evolving robotic controllers that were running on Android phones and like powering these small little robots that were all run off of Android. So really just like I started learning off of that Android for Dummies book and have been doing Android ever since now. I think like 6-7 years now at this point.
That's so interesting. Like so many good opportunities like that.
Yeah.
Like right from the get-go, you take a class that you didn't even really want to take. You see a practical application in a job environment, you apply it, it works out. And like it's just like good thing after good thing after that. That's awesome. That's like you must feel very fortunate. That's like a very
Absolutely.
that's a really great, like so practical and just great. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been really lucky to kind of chart the career path that I have. And I would say nowadays I'm much more intentional about it. But sort of at the beginning there, it was very, I guess, accidental in a sense. Because yeah, I wasn't looking to get into Android. I just happened to pick up a book on it. And, you know, that then led to another opportunity with school. And then when I was graduating from grad school, I was looking for jobs. And I wasn't necessarily looking for Android jobs, but at that point, I had a couple Android projects under my belt. In fact, I had put two apps at that point in the Play Store just because I wanted to see what that full end-to-end software development process was like. And, you know, at the time that like wasn't a big thing to me, but then, you know, a year after putting that in the store and I was looking for jobs, that ended up being this huge differentiator on like my resume and portfolio, because some of the people I was interviewing with, you know, they themselves had never even released something to the App Store, because, you know, they would generate an APK and then hand it off to like the product manager who would do that. So I was able to kind of like just, leverage this experience and build on it and kind of go from one thing to the next, which has been awesome.
So I'm hearing a lot of really good things, and usually that's fine, but I actually want to hear something bad. Like tell me something you struggled with. Like it sounds like it was like something great happened accidentally. It turned out to be something you liked and you were good at. You followed it down the track and it was like good thing after good thing. Tell me about some of the difficulties you had learning these things, because I know from my experience, and obviously a lot of people ask me about it too, is Android's a very difficult thing to learn, I think, compared to other languages. You said you started with Python and then you worked your way to Android. Tell me something you struggled with. I'd like to hear something bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was not without struggles for sure. So I think like the first big struggle for me was going from a degree like in geography, which was my undergrad, and then coming over into grad school. I was really worried that I wasn't going to have like the programming chops to keep up with people, particularly in the research lab that I was in. And so that was really like, at the time I didn't think of it as imposter syndrome, but that was like the first time I was really hitting that hard, because like every day I was kind of questioning, you know, if I was going to be able to like write code that was going to work or not, or if I was going to be holding up the team. So I remember like stressing out about that quite a bit in kind of the early days. And so then I was trying to make up for that by kind of looking for resources on my own. Like I thought maybe if I can't be, you know, is much of a resource in just sort of like general software engineering, I thought I could brush up like on the Android side of things. But that at the time was kind of its own big challenge. Like, you know, 6 years ago or something, we didn't have all that we do today in terms of online resources. We didn't have all those years of like Stack Overflow posts that you can just go and Google and find your answer. So I really struggled a lot to have, to basically figure out the right way to do things. And I would say that's something that like the environment I was in wasn't great for either. Like I didn't have like really a mentor per se. I didn't have other people that were kind of like learning the same thing. So I felt very much on an island in terms of just like, I felt like it was up to me to figure this stuff out. I actually think that's largely why today I like to kind of help people learn as much as possible, because I guess I'm trying to like a little bit be the resource I wish I would have had, back then.
Yeah, the Android community I think is very unique. You know, I think it's very unique because everybody shares their experiences, everybody shares their code. If you look at like Android dev on Reddit, for example, like everybody is so helpful, and it Stack Overflow posts, everything just blows my mind constantly of how helpful everybody is. And I think a lot of it is because Android is so difficult, and because now the resources are better, but before they weren't so good. Even when I started, maybe I only started 3 years ago. When I started, there is a significant difference from then to now, like in terms of the documentation, the examples, like the Google samples, all that stuff. So, that's my thoughts anyway. It could be just Google picking it up, but I think a big part of it is the community.
I totally agree. Like, I think a lot of that was like we had to, as like an Android community, like it had to sort of crowdsource all the documentation and tutorials for years. And I do think Google's gotten a lot better about that these days. Like they are much better about the documentation and samples they put out. That said, I still think there's a lot of room for improvement there, because like a lot of those great resources and stuff are all focused in like very specific areas, or like on very small, like ideal perfect sample apps. And so some of those examples I feel like don't scale as well, but I'm still happy that like they're trending in that direction. Like particularly the architecture components, like there's a lot of awesome resources for that these days. So it makes it really easy to sort of go from nothing up to like understanding the fundamentals, which like that's huge. Because honestly, like I'd love to have like all those advanced tutorials, but by the time you're ready for those, you're kind of capable of figuring out some of that stuff too. So I think they're kind of tackling it in the right order. But I do hope to can see those improve.
Yeah, for sure. And in terms of the examples too, like some code labs are really good, and then some are not good. It's really weird. Like it's almost like totally different sets of people make some, and then totally different sets of people make others. Because some will like break down the scenarios, they'll paint you a picture, and then some are just like, here's how to do this thing with no background knowledge, and you're just kind of following along, and you don't, and it leaves out steps, and you're lost after it. It's really interesting. I don't know. I think it's kind of like a work in progress. Like it's slowly, iteratively getting better.
Yeah. That's actually like, this is kind of jumping topics a little bit, but, people a lot of time will ask, how to start like blogging or like a YouTube channel. So like just how to like start like being involved in kind of the community in that way. And a lot of times I find that like just reviewing something like a code lab or someone at like one of the official blog posts and filling in those missing steps is sometimes like a really like useful thing. Cause like I found blog posts before that are like, oh, this shows me like 99% how to do it. But like, there's this one thing they left out that makes it all worthless. And then I'll find like another post that someone else wrote that's like, oh yeah, like there was a typo on line 27 that fixes the entire thing.
Yeah.
And so sometimes like those little tiny things are a really awesome way, and sometimes like the most useful way to like start contributing.
That's a good example. That's a good practical example. You're right, because you've already sat there and you've wasted your time. You've invested.
Yeah.
You've invested your time to figure out this thing and to get it working, which is not working. Yeah, you might as well share with the Android community, and that's what the Android community is all about. So let's switch gears a little here, and I want to talk about your work sort of progression. So you're a GIS analyst, which I don't even know what that is. It's some kind of geography analyst, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So GIS, it stands for Geographic Information Systems.
Okay.
The easiest way these days to describe it is just like big data attached to a location. Like the whole idea of this field, which like it's been around for 50, 60 years. So it's not a new field, but it's just that like these days we have scale and we have the internet. So it's much more like prevalent. But yeah, basically the idea was just, you go out there and are collecting information about a point or an area or a feature, and then being able to like make, decisions and run analysis on that data.
Okay.
So that was like my whole background up until basically my senior year of college. And then actually like that was the first company I worked at, was at a GIS software company, pretty much the company that like started the field. So I was able to sort of like take like all of that domain knowledge and transfer that into my first job, which wasn't really using it, but because the company was there, like it played in my favor during the interview process.
Right. Okay. So that was with Python. You started with Python, and then how did you start becoming employable as an Android dev, I guess is the next.
Yeah, totally. So like that started kind of before, like basically when I started learning Android. Like I picked up the book and I kind of set a goal. I was like, hey, I have 9 months till grad school started. I'm gonna build an app and put it in the Play Store, which I did. It was an app that would help me automatically schedule texts to my girlfriend, now wife, and so that I wouldn't forget to text her.
Smart. Wow.
Yeah.
Smart guy.
She didn't like it as much, but it was a good first project. But so like that right there was kind of like that first step, because like I mentioned, the fact that I put a project in the Play Store, like actually finish something, like that experience is really valuable. And being able to talk through how to do that and then how to report crashes and fix those, all of that was really valuable. And then, I put a couple other things in the Play Store during grad school as well. One was like a Texas Hold'em poker app that we built for a software engineering class. And then I had all this research that was all being done on Android devices as well, which had given me experience into like writing C++ and interfacing with the JNI to improve like an image processing algorithm. And so it was like all of these like small targeted projects on Android I was kind of able to collect. And so I highlighted that very heavily in like my resume. Instead of trying to highlight, 2 years of computer science, I tried to more highlight, these are the projects I've done. Like this is the actual like real world experience I have. And then tried to focus on that during, all of the interviews and typing up cover letters, resumes, all that kind of stuff.
So you straight up just started applying for Android jobs. Like you just when was the critical mass point when you decided you knew enough and you were ready to start applying?
That's a good question. I don't know that I necessarily knew I was ready. I think, in all honesty, it was a combination of I was graduating and needed to find a job. So that was a forcing function in some regards. But then it was also just a matter of trying to maximize my skill set, I guess, because coming out of school, a lot of the people that I had been going to school with didn't necessarily have like a specialty, we'll say. They were kind of just general software developers, had done, a bunch of different types of things, but hadn't gone real deep anywhere. And I noticed that they had been having a bit of a hard time finding a job. Or I shouldn't even say had a bit of a hard time finding jobs, because lots of them found jobs, but it was kind of the funnel. Like because they weren't specialized, they were sort of getting into that like really wide general like new grad hiring funnel. And so I just started like looking for jobs that were a little bit more specific. And the only specific skill I really had at that point was Android. And so even though it wasn't a lot of Android at that point, it was enough that I felt comfortable like talking about how to build an application. I felt comfortable enough with kind of the basics. I could describe like an activity and a fragment at the time, which was pretty new. And so I just decided like I had nothing to lose. And I thought, it would possibly help me get my name in the door at some different places, which it ultimately did. There were several interviews I went through at places where I don't think I would have gotten an interview had I gone through like the general process.
Right. Okay. So what, and then who was like your first employer as an Android dev? Do you mind telling us what the company was?
Absolutely. So the first company I worked with, their name is ESRI. Some people pronounce it Esri. But that is, they kind of invented the field of geographic information systems. So they are a large, like global company, $1 billion a year in revenue, thousands of employees, been around, I think 50 or 60 years. So I came into that And it was a really amazing first job. I'm really grateful that that was my first job, because like the engineers I worked with were terrific and taught me a lot about just like software engineering practices, and how to build a good product. But it was a very different working environment than kind of my last two companies. So they were very slow pace. Like because it's such a large company, they moved much more slowly. So I think we released something. Excuse me. We released the product I was working on like twice a year. And when we would do a release, it would be like a 2 or 3 week code freeze with like this massive verification checklist. The crash rate was basically non-existent. I mean, like that by the
Oh,
time we released something, it was super, super, super stable. And that came at the cost of like we released very, very slowly. So the flip side of that, like, is if there was a bug that we did find, it would often take months before that actually would get released in the wild. So that was a bit of a different experience. And then similarly, like we had a lot of support. And by support, I mean we had multiple designers, multiple product engineers, multiple QA people. So we had a lot of work going into the product as a whole, not just the code. And I think one of the byproducts of that was they tended to work very like waterfall too. So there was a lot of top down, like a lot of people would spend a bunch of time and energy figuring out how something should work, how it should be built, and then passing it down to the chain to us. And then we would then have to spend a lot of time and sort of hash it out and sort of make it work for the platform. Like if the time material design had just come out. So, you know, there was this kind of interesting dynamic going on where the developers were following materials design really closely and advocating for it, but the design team hadn't really adopted it. And so there was a lot of back and forth that had to go on.
oh, I see. So the designers are more like in that scenario, the designers are more like the clients. Like they sound like they don't know, like if you were doing a freelance project and you got a client and they had an app idea, they don't know anything about technology. They don't know anything about Android. They don't know how all that works. It's your job to filter that information and get it down to something that's real. And that sounds like the same scenario in this company. It was big, and they maybe had an idea but not a specific design, and then it would go to you guys and do like a back and forth kind of thing.
Uh, a little bit. So like they had a good idea of technology, and kind of mobile, but I will say, and this isn't uncommon, but like they tended to be more iOS focused. So like a lot of times what we would see is we would get a design, but it would be very iOS centric. So it would look like iOS. Some of the just like navigation patterns or UI patterns would be that way. So we really had to advocate for Android as a platform.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so that was it wasn't so much of like completely trying to like transform their vision. Like they had a good idea of what they wanted. We just had to make it work for
Android.
Android, which was something
Right.
like we very much wanted to sort of honor that ecosystem.
Sounds like me and Don talked about a bit about that in the podcast we did too, because he said his first freelance experiences, I believe it was his first freelance. I don't think he ever had an Android dev job. It was all freelance. Yeah. He had guys or companies coming up to him saying, "Hey, can you build this app? We want it to look just like the iOS app." And so it sounds like it was sort of similar at the company you worked at. They wanted an app that was Android, but just to copy the iOS version.
Yeah, I think that was definitely the mindset, and it wasn't everybody, and like that was at a certain point, the closer we got to like the actual development, obviously, the more we cared about the platform. But yeah, there was definitely some back and forth there.
Well, iOS dominated the space, I think, at the
Oh
start.
yeah,
Like they had better hardware, their app store was better. It was just better. Like there's no like going around that. I mean, I was an Apple guy only up to a few years ago, just because literally everything was better. And then now it's not the case. Android has the same or better hardware for less price, and of course the software is great too. So it's definitely caught up, I think.
yeah, very much so. And same thing, like you're saying, early days, like the global market share difference wasn't as pronounced as it was. And the company I was at was like very much sort of an enterprisey or like government type of business, and so a lot of those places have money to spend, so they were buying iPads, And so, yeah, just it made sense at the time. And I think these days, like there's a much greater emphasis on that team with Android. Just because I've tried to stay up to date with them, because there was a great team to work with. And so I try and like pick their brain from time to time. We meet up at conferences and whatnot.
Oh, that's cool. So you still keep in touch with the guys who you had your first Android dev job with?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's one in particular who's my sort of mentor at the time. He's my first manager, and helped me a lot. It helped me out a lot in those early days. We still talk weekly. We have a lot in common. And it was really invaluable to kind of have someone in that first role that was, patient and encouraged me to ask all the different kinds of questions and would take the time to kind of sit down and explain things. And like that relationship has lasted to this day.
That's really cool. That's again, I bet you feel very fortunate that you have that. Because
Absolutely.
I would definitely feel that way if I had a mentor in the programming space, because there's just, especially when you're starting out, there's just, I guess YouTube is now basically that, right? Like if I wanted to get some good advice about Flutter, I would leave a comment on, Kotlin, I would leave a comment on one of your videos or somebody's videos, and they would answer me. So it's sort of, I guess, outsourced to online people now. But
yeah, I do think that is a very real phenomena. Like just with social media these days, Twitter in the Android world, or YouTube, like you said, Instagram, all the different online learning platforms out there. There are a lot of people that are very available these days. That said, I think a lot of times people, when they're just starting out, don't even know what questions to ask necessarily.
Yeah, for sure.
That was something I saw a lot at my second job at U.S.A, like being around students that were just trying to learn Android or programming or whatever. A lot of times it's overwhelming. Like sometimes, it'll say, download and install Android Studio. And like, they're not even sure necessarily how to like do that properly, or like the version is slightly different and like the start screen is different. So like that becomes a blocker. So while it's easier than ever to like find that mentorship, sometimes having that much more one-on-one relationship, I think, is still really valuable.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like I would take a guy I knew in person over an online guy any day. Like a guy, like a friend. If my friend was an Android developer with 15 years of experience, I'd be in my happy place, like that would be, I could do no wrong. Basically, I would just ask him. And because it's funny how like one little thing, like you go up to somebody, imagine you have a question, you go up to them and you have no idea. Your question's probably wrong. Like it's probably a question that doesn't even make sense. You ask the guy, he's going to take your question, say, here's why your question is wrong, and then direct you into the right place. He probably just saved you like 40 hours of wasted time and wasted research time, and then just to figure out that your question was wrong, and let alone where you were going. Like it's a huge time sink, I think, or potential time sink.
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, if the people like listening or watching later took nothing else away, I feel like that right there would be like a key point of just like, if you have a question, like whatever it is, like, reach out, ask someone, like, especially in the Android space. I know like everyone is super helpful. And so, yeah, like basically being efficient with your time. And like, sometimes it's scary to reach out to that person that you haven't talked to before, or sometimes you just like don't want to seem like you don't know the answer. But like, honestly, we're all in that place constantly. And so if you can like learn to sort of get comfortable with that and reach out, you become so much more efficient. Like I get asked sometimes, how long until you have to stop like looking up documentation for certain APIs? And my answer is always like, never. Like I have to look up documentation always. Like even if I think I know it, a lot of times I'll still look it up just to double check or to see if there's a new version or something. And so like that, I feel like is just one of the fundamental things that can really help you grow as an engineer. And that was what I basically was taught in that first role, that like it was okay to ask as many questions as I needed to. And so if people are in a position where like that's not encouraged on their team, I would encourage them to find that elsewhere if they can, and then also maybe find a new role if they can, because I think it should be, but that's a much bigger proposition than just asking someone on Twitter.
Yeah, I would say like never ever put memorization on a pedestal. I think
Absolutely.
like that's great. Like it's cool. Like, and it will save time. It's not a bad thing, but I think putting it on a pedestal is a bad thing because there's nothing wrong with having to look things up. There's just so much information, and it's almost a good thing to just, like you said, double check. Like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I could just whip up a recycle view by memory or whip up a recycle view adapter by memory, but like maybe I want to check a couple of methods and like how I got the list in there last time, or like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Say just a quick glance. Like it's not a bad thing. I had a question and now I can't. Oh, sorry, not a question. So we were just talking about reaching out to the Android community and asking for help. I actually want to talk to the audience here. I'll tell you how to ask for help effectively because I get a lot of emails, as you can imagine, because I have a YouTube channel teaching people how to code. This is how you want to send this is how you don't want to send an email. Don't email me saying with the title help and then, sir, can you help me? Don't send that. I'm not going to respond. Like, I need to know that you put an effort in your question. I need to see like specific things that you've tried, specific things that you think might be the right way. Like, give me something to go off of. I don't want to read something and then have to, you want to save me as much time as possible in your question. That's the goal. And then, like I have no problem helping people. And I'm like we said, the Android community is really great. I've spent 3 to 4 hours just helping one person before. I mean, they had something that I was interested in, to be honest, but they also asked their question in an intelligent way. They said, this is what I'm confused about. This is what I've tried. Here's some code, some code snippets. Here's the link to my GitHub, whatever. It's like, I don't want to have to ask you for things. Like, I don't want this to turn into a back and forth. Like, save me time. That's what I would say. What do you think? I'm sure you get emails too.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I mean, I just like adding to that, like, I think there's a practical sense from that too. It's just like you're saying, you don't want to do a bunch of going back and forth. So the more information you can give up front, it just limits their turnaround time on that. Especially I found, if you're working like internationally or something, a lot of times I'll like have questions at like 10, 11 o'clock at night when I'm getting ready to go to bed. And so like, if we have to have a bunch of back and forths, if, we're trying to discuss an issue, that just like increases the likelihood that we can't finish it before sort of like, I have to go to bed or something. And so, yeah, if you can like list out what you've tried, what resources you've already looked at, a link to code is always like huge. Like so often I've been in situations where we go back and forth for quite a while. And then finally I just ask like, hey, is the code somewhere I can look at it? And if it is, like a lot of times you can find the issue really fast. So yeah, the more info you can give, the better for sure.
So there you go. That's how you get help, boys and girls. So let's see your job progression. You were an Android dev. So after working at the big company, did you continue working at companies, or when did you? Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
What was your next job? I guess is my question.
Yeah. So after U.S.A, I moved on to Udacity, which that was a big change. That was going very much into sort of the Silicon Valley, like startup world. We went from releasing twice. So ESRI, the product I worked on, I think we released like 3 times the whole time I was working on that project. In my first month at Udacity, I personally put out 2 releases. And so like that was a huge change right there. And just we released, every couple of weeks, sometimes every week.
So you're not working on the content because Udacity.
Nope.
I'm looking it up. Udacity is a education thing, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's,
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that because when I would tell people, or when people saw that I did Android at Udacity, everyone thought that I worked
I think you're an author or something. That's
what that's what everyone thought. But I was on the engineering side of the company, so I worked on the Android app. And so like I mean I knew the people working on the content, talked with them, friends with them, but I never got to work on a course. I tried, I pitched it a couple of times, but it never
wouldn't let you. Why not?
It wasn't so much a wouldn't let you. I just like I don't think we ever approached it that seriously. Like I'm sure we could have had a conversation about it had I tried to push it more seriously.
Yeah, so you were just kind of like off the cuff. Hey, you should let me do a course, Bill. And you know.
Yeah, kind of. And I mean, to some of the right people that would have had a say in it, that, knew that, it wasn't that off the wall of an idea, just based on, stuff I had done at speaking, or, my YouTube channel, which had just started. But part of the rationale too is that, like, just software developer made a lot more money. So I wasn't sure how the financial aspect of that would have worked out either. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, you devs, you guys are all rich, especially if you work in Silicon Valley. What I watched a video on a guy who just got a job at Uber, and I think he said his salary was like 267K US.
oh,
That's fucking insane.
that's crazy. Yeah.
That's like literally a quarter in Canada. So I live in Canada. It's your dollars or our dollars about 30% less. So, what would that put him? That put me, if I was a Canadian working that, I'd be getting over 300 grand a year.
Yeah.
Like that's a lot of money.
It really is.
Yeah, like that is a lot of money for and for a lot of the devs too. They're young guys, or yeah,
Absolutely.
mostly young men actually. Some young females, but mostly young men.
Yeah. I mean, in Seattle, it's not as like bad as Silicon Valley, but we have that same kind of thing going on. A lot of, new grads that are coming out and going to Amazon and starting at like 200K a year plus like a 50K signing bonus or something. And it's a ton of money. I was kind of wrestling with that when I was recently looking for a new job, kind of, because I had opportunities to go look at some of these other places and I knew what the pay was and whatnot. But the flip side of that is just like the lifestyle with that and the work-life balance and all that, because, like some of those places that are notorious for 60, 70, 80-hour weeks, which was not something I was interested in. And I've never worked at a place that was that bad. But there are times like with Udacity where we were pushing a lot and I was working definitely more hours than I would have liked to be, trying to get, the next big thing out the door. I think that was a situation where it taught me a lot about how I don't like to build software. Not necessarily that it's inherently the wrong way, but just I don't like doing it that way. And that was really valuable. Like sometimes finding the lesson within the bad situation, I think, is really helpful.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Like that's super valuable with programming. Like all of you, this is something I was thinking about. I think it might've been today when I was walking my dogs, or yesterday. I was thinking like, there's a lot of value in knowing what not to do. Like a lot of people think, because programming is hard. It's usually like, if you're learning to program or you're learning something, it's usually failure, 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 failure. Got it. It's like, it's usually like, it's never like, it's almost never got it. It's usually fail, 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 got it. It takes a while. Like from learning anything, whether you're learning to use retrofit, learning Dagger, learning proper architecture, it's like you always screw up a whole bunch and then you figure out the way to do it. And a lot of people don't like that. They think, oh, they've wasted a bunch of time, but it's really valuable, I think, because it burns that into your memory. Like you're not going to forget that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of the pain, you like the pain and then success. That's the way to do it, because you won't forget it.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, that was definitely my experience a few times at like Udacity. I mean, the first time I had to put out a release, I was terrified. I mean, I double checked and triple checked. I was really, really worried that like I was gonna, break the production app and they were gonna have, all these users not be able to use things. And you know what, like it didn't happen the first time or the second time, but eventually, like, sure enough, you broke something, but it's not the end of the world. And you sort of learn to get comfortable with that. You learn how to respond to it efficiently. I mean, I think that's a key thing, is just like learning to efficiently respond to the mistakes and be able to learn from them correctly, communicate them, openly and honestly, and be able to kind of take that and move on.
And don't panic. Don't panic, I'm sure.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you can kind of wrap your head around the fact that like it's going to happen at some point and you're just kind of prepared for that, then while it's not the best thing in the world, it doesn't become the worst thing either. Like it becomes just kind of a small blip in your week, hopefully, as opposed to sort of this world crushing event, which is sometimes what it feels like. I mean, the first few releases, I was really convinced that I was just gonna like bring down mobile for the company, and I was gonna have
Bring down the App Store. He's gonna bring down the App
yeah,
Store,
yeah, exactly.
or Google Play. Sorry.
Yeah, it definitely was overestimating my ability to impact things on a large scale. Um, but yeah, I mean, those are the lessons that you don't learn until you're actually kind of in there and doing it. Honestly, it's another reason why I encourage people to actually like finish a project and like put it in the App Store, even if it's super small, even if it's a joke app or something, but like that actual like process of like putting something up there, learning what that looks like, learning what happens when you accidentally break something and start getting bad user reviews, like all of that is really, really valuable information. And honestly, it's hard to get unless you're at a certain type of company. Like I've always been, I was going to say I've always been fortunate. I view it as being fortunate. Some people probably wouldn't, but I've always worked on really small teams. Like the largest team I've ever worked on was 5 developers. So I've always had a lot of sort of impact into the project and access. So being able to actually like access the developer console, respond to user reviews, like basically just being able to do anything related to the project, which is awesome experience. And it really helps you understand the entirety of the software engineering process. But if you're in a really large company, like if you're joining Uber as a new grad today and you're one of their 200 Android developers, I'm not sure that you're getting access to like the release process at Uber. Like I don't think you're going to be able to go in there and actually like launch, an update to the app. So
No, you probably get to edit like 10% of one of the activities, and that's like what you own.
exactly. Yeah, and your whole job is to like make that as amazing and as efficient and performant as possible. Which like there's a lot of great value in that too. But for me, I think I like to have my hands on everything a little bit. So I've kind of strayed away from that style. But I know people that are the opposite. I know I've talked to people that really like being in that huge company and working with problems at the scale that only places like Uber and Google and Facebook provide. So I think that's another thing. This is sort of a tangent circling back to the beginning a little
It's all
bit.
a tangent. It's all
Yeah,
a
right.
tangent. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Like thinking about, finding your first job, right? Or, just finding a job out of school. I was like this, and I talked to a lot of people that are like this, but like they're hyper focused on like the FANG companies. They want to work at Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, or now maybe some of the really big startups like Uber. And like there's kind of this notion that like that is where you have to be to like have a good career or to like make a good living. And so like when you really narrow that focus down, you kind of set yourself up for failure in a sense, just because like the odds of getting into those places are much lower. But I think more importantly, like you're limiting yourself from all the amazing experience that you could get elsewhere. And that was what happened with me. Like I went to Esri, which is like it's a big company, but nobody's ever heard of it. Has a very small development team. But then I got to come in and just like immediately have a massive impact on a project and get all this experience. And now I couldn't imagine going anywhere else. Like I don't know that I would have had such great mentorship or had so much say in what I was working on had I gone to the big company. So I encourage people to, not just look at your companies for like the name recognition of that company, which I think also then really helps, get your name in the door. Like if you're applying to places that are getting hundreds of resumes instead of hundreds of thousands of resumes, just automatically like your odds of getting a job go way up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty biased with this myself because I've obviously never worked at a big company, so I don't know what it's like. So I'm just imagining. I don't think it would be a good time. I think it would be really terrible. Like if a company offered me 300K to drive, half an hour to work every day, and they'd tell you that you probably only have to work 8 hours a day, but you'd probably be working more like 9. Plus, you'd have a pager to take home every week or
Yep.
every second week or whatever. Like, when you really do the math on that, like you're gonna get up. I go to the gym every day. If I'm working 9 hours at the place, I got an hour commute each way. Like you're already at 11 hours. I go to the gym, work out. That's 12 and a half hours. I'm coming home, I'm making dinner or making my lunch, and I'm going to bed, and that's my
Yeah.
life. And then on weekends, a lot of companies, like I said, they want you to take home a pager. I know tons of guys who are working, and every second week or so, they got to take home a pager, and they're on call 24/7. And yeah, you're making money, but doesn't sound like much of a life to me.
I
Sounds like a
agree.
good way to get very depressed very quickly, and how to deteriorate all of the relationships in your life very quickly, and how to probably become very unhealthy physically. I don't know. It just doesn't. But like I said, I'm so biased because I haven't done it. I work from home, like but that's just what it seems like to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. Like that's the path I've taken. I mean, I've gone from my company size just continues to shrink. I mean, I went from my first company, which was thousands of employees worldwide, down to Udacity, which only had a few hundred, to now my current employer has, I think, 12 or maybe 13 of us. But yeah, I keep shrinking away from that for all those same reasons. Like I would rather make half as much money, but work half as much, be stressed out, a tenth as much, and basically have my time. I was listening to another podcast recently, and someone described the idea of like buying their time back. They were describing it as like reinvesting into their business, but I think it kind of applies here too. Like, taking less money to work 40 hours a week instead of 60 hours a week. Like in some sense, you're just buying those hours back. Like, yeah, you don't have as much money, but you have time, you can relax, you can exercise, you can have hobbies, like you can have a life.
How much money do you really need? Like really?
Exactly. I mean, at some point you're right. Like you don't need it all. Like I've talked to friends who like are making that kind of money, and are either I've talked to on one end of the spectrum that's like, yeah, I don't really like my job that much. I also don't need the money, but I'm just not sure what I would do with my day if I didn't have it. I think I would just binge Netflix all day. And so they almost stay just out of fear of not being able to manage their time.
That's interesting.
Or talk to people that are like, yeah, I'm going to retire at 31 for at least 5 years and then see what I want to do, which that to me sounds at least more interesting, because at least they're gonna go travel or do whatever. But I want to be in the middle of that somewhere. Like I like working, I like solving problems and all that. I just want to do it in a reasonable, sustainable way.
Yeah, sustainable. That's the key word there. I want to wake up and feel like, yeah, I'm gonna go do some shit today, and it's gonna be good, and then I'm gonna stop, and then I'm gonna do the same thing tomorrow, and it's all gonna be good, as opposed to waking up and feeling miserable. And I don't know, doesn't seem good to me.
Absolutely. I mean, I've had periods in my career where waking up and going to work just was the last thing I wanted to do. And I've had periods where I can't wait to wake up and jump back whatever it is I'm working on. And it's so much nicer when you actually are looking forward to it.
Oh yeah, you even affect all the people around you. Like if you're a miserable piece of shit, you're wandering around through life, people aren't gonna like you. They're not gonna want to be around you. And you have a bunch of money. The retiring at 31 thing sounds interesting to me too. The only thing is, I think that it would require a very disciplined person to save that money during that time when they feel like shit and they're working very hard. Like they're gonna want the BMW to make themselves feel better. They're gonna want the beautiful apartment downtown that costs them $6,000 a month because it makes them feel better. I think it's very hard to resist those tempting things when you're working your ass off and that's all you do is work. So, yeah, it could be done, but I think it'd be tricky. And again, I'm very biased. Like right out of the gate, I'm very biased here. So don't listen to what I say.
I'm biased too. And while we've been chatting about this, I've been thinking of it if someone's listening and they feel the opposite, they would rather just dive in and work, and they don't have, a family commitment or anything, awesome. I mean, I think that's another thing, like anything there, people want the right answer. They want to know like the best career path. They want to know the best way to architect your app. And so often it just is always like, it depends. I mean, you can sort of like give advice and whatnot, but at the end of the day, you need to take some time and just like evaluate what is important to you. Same thing. I mean, work-life balance is this way too, constantly. Like everyone wants to know like what the right work-life balance is, but it depends on you. I mean, sometimes it depends on like the day or the week even. So like you just kind of have to check in with yourself, I think, and be mindful of what is working and what's not.
Yeah, the architecture question too. There's no best architecture. It's whatever works for your project and whatever makes sense to you. I'll just get that out of the way.
Absolutely.
So you're working now. You went from this company, the big company, to Udacity, and now you're working. Now this is your next job that you're working at right now.
Yeah. Yep. So
And you're remote. You work remote from home.
Yes. Yep. So I started this new job in January, end of January, end of February. I don't remember which now. But so yeah, I've been there around 6 months, and it has been a very interesting change of pace. It's by far the smallest company I've ever worked at. Like I said, it's like 13 people now, so it's really small. And they follow a very so I don't know, are you familiar with Basecamp, like the company Basecamp? So they follow Basecamp's model of how they work. So, for those that aren't familiar, Basecamp, they put out books called things like "It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work" or "Remote Office Not Required." It's like they're a very remote friendly company. They're a very employee friendly company. They believe in things like no meetings, not releasing things on Fridays, like just developing software in a reasonable, sustained way, like we were just talking about.
Like just a logical way to run a business, it sounds like.
Yes, very much so. Like that's another thing they believe in is like, not chasing hyper growth by just like funneling more money in and inflating your metrics. Like they believe in actually building a sustainable business model. And so these are all things that my new company, PickSite, it like really believes in and is trying to cultivate. And so it's been really fun to sort of be into this environment, like going from a true Silicon Valley startup, which was trying to grow as much as possible, to now this very small, sustained company. Like I have a hard time describing it sometimes because it's small, like a startup, but it's been around for 10 years, which like most startups haven't been around for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And so it's this interesting kind of space where
they're growing the right way. That's, I think, what's happening. They're doing the right things to grow the right way. So their company is just steady progression. They're really building a solid company.
Absolutely. And they talk very much about, wanting to take care of employees, like wanting to, give us time to, stay healthy physically and mentally, encourage us to take a day off if we need it, you're feeling stressed or whatnot. We work in 6-week sessions, and then we take a 2-week sort of break where there's time to catch up on things or prototype or explore or just like take a day off or something if you need. So it's all meant to just like be sustainable, both in the development process and in the financials. And you can kind of see that in like how they've grown over the years, how they've expanded kind of methodically and with a purpose, and then like reinvesting money back into, adding benefits for the employees or improving existing benefits.
So that's the way to run a company. That's what I think is the best way to run a company. Like that sounds great. Although I don't have any experience. Who am I? I'm 29 years old. I have no employees, and I've never worked for a big company. What do I know? But that sounds like the way I would want to do things.
I agree. It makes sense to me. It's been really fun. It's also just fun whenever you kind of switch teams, switch companies, and you jump into a new code base for the first time. Because suddenly, like you're seeing all these different patterns and libraries and just approaches for doing things, and that's been fascinating. Like I've been here 6 months, and like just today merged like this big PR that was really like kind of my first crack at like implementing sort of this newer architecture that we're trying to adopt. And like I mean, like I said, 6 months in, and I'm still sort of just like cutting my teeth into the code base and still getting up to speed on everything. So it's really interesting. I feel like anytime you can kind of switch like that, which is one reason I get, I've talked to some people who talk about the frequency and switching jobs, how often is too often. I like to stay at a place at least a year, like any job I stay, unless it was just absolutely horrible. I always think like I would need like at least a year to like actually fully like understand what I'm working on, how it's working, to be able to see like how the processes and all that are going. Um, so I don't know. That's just like another like little thing to think about, like when you're evaluating roles and all of that, is just like how much time it can take just to get up to speed. Like you don't come into a new job and like feel productive day one or
No.
month one, and sometimes even year one. Like at Udacity, it was a full year before I remember feeling like really comfortable with my day-to-day job and being able to jump into like any part of the code base.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about like scaling up, I guess you would say. But like, but I don't want to scale up for just the sake of scaling up. Like if I'm going to hire somebody, I want them to like be part of the company. Like I almost want a profit share, just
Mhm.
so that they're part of the company. That's that. And like what you described seems like a way to do that. Like it's like you're an employee. I would like it if you came in, but I don't really care. Like you can work from home. If you want to take a day off, take a week off. I don't care. Like I want the freedom kind of thing. But I want them still invested. I want them invested. I would want them to
Mhm.
feel like they're part of it. Like we're building something together, not we're building something for me and I pay you.
Yeah.
I just think that like mentally the employees will be far superior. Like, there's something like I'm sure anybody could go to work and seem busy. I think that would be one of the easiest things in the world to do. Just go to work and do stuff and appear to be busy. But if you're actually doing things that have like foresight and you're thinking about the future, which you would do if you were invested into something, is probably like superior, like far superior.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you said that thing too about like it's really easy to look busy at work. That kind of rung a bell for me because I was just reading Basecamp's book. It doesn't have to be crazy at work, and like one of the things they talk about in several of their books is the idea that like a lot of times when you're pushing or promoting like remote work in your organization, one of the common concerns that comes up is like, well, how will you know that people are working like if they're not at their desk? And it's so funny because like it's so easy to like be pretending to work at your desk, or like so easy to just
Yeah,
like sort of like
like
look busy. Whereas like if all you're evaluating is the output and like are you producing enough quality work, then what does it matter if it took you 3 hours or 10 hours to do that? And like I don't know, like for me, if I like was working with someone, if they can finish it in 4 hours and then spend the other 4 hours of their day like taking care of the rest of their life, running errands, staying like mentally and physically fit, like that's going to pay off in the long run. So like
yeah.
why do you care as long as the work is enough? So
Like someone has to stay up late one night. Maybe they don't get enough sleep, and your strict rule at your company is that they come in at 7 a.m. but they've only had 4 hours of sleep. Like they're gonna be a bag of shit that day. They're gonna just barely do enough to look busy, and then go home. Like that's
yeah.
as opposed to being like, oh no, whatever, come in whenever, sleep in, uh, hope that they'll still get their work done. Like hoping that they'll still get their work done is a much better situation than dragging them in and telling them to get their work done. I think like because you could just look busy, and I don't know. I think it's short-sighted and naive. I like to think that that would be the outcome.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, if you can't acknowledge that people are, phoning in a big portion of their hours when they're
Oh
forced
yeah,
to do like the regular, 8 to 5, then there's other issues going on.
yeah. So you're currently working at this company. You've been there for 6 months. Um, so you're an Android dev there, and you work
Yep.
mostly with Kotlin.
Yep.
So you talked about an architecture that you just pushed, or new architecture. What
Yeah.
what type of architectures do you typically work with, and what sort of Android specific libraries and technologies do you guys typically work with? And what's this new architecture that you're talking about?
Sure. So trying to think of the best way to describe it. I mean, it's not. It's I would say it's inspired in some ways by like MVI or just the idea of like unidirectional data flow. Um, it's a very kind of reactive driven approach as well. So one way I think in which it differs from like a true MVI is that we're basically trying to get to a point where we encapsulating basically all or as much of all of the logic as we can, like in our view model, but then exposing basically two properties on that view model, both of them being some type of observable. So
So like a
one being
state, like a state variable that holds a bunch of things.
Yep. So we have essentially a view state, which is a sealed class of the different kind of configurations of our view. And then we have some view events. And so the view event might be something like, you know, page selected or book selected, and we can propagate that out and let, you know, the activity or whoever else respond to that by maybe navigating to a new screen or something, or loading a deep link. And then, you know, we can pull in all of our items, we can respond to events coming in, and then those all get filtered basically through like a single observable chain.
Right.
And at the end of that chain, they basically just get mapped into this view state. So it makes it really easy both to understand where to manipulate that state, because it always goes in roughly like the same chain. But then it makes it super easy to test that, because
You can just test the different. Would you call them fields? Would you call them fields in the state? Is that what you would call them?
Yeah,
Like
yeah. Yeah, you could call you could refer them as fields. I mean, ultimately that's like what it is, right? Like we have,
yeah.
you know, like a data class or a sealed class. So you know, like on our view state for like this one screen I'm working on, I think we had basically like an is loading field. We had like a data field that was just like a list of these sealed class objects to represent different elements on the screen, or an error object. And so
Right.
basically there's like those three properties, and then in your activity, you basically just say like, okay, if I see the loading thing, I show the loading view. If I have these items, I convert those into adapter items and put them in my list. And if I have an error, I show the error. So like the view layer, in this case, the fragment becomes really, really simple. Like there's basically no logic in there. And the view model becomes really, really testable, because it basically is working kind of just like a simple function at this point. Like, you know, basically it's like a state reducer. It's taking in some inputs, which like in this case, we're pulling data in from some different live data sources, and then that's all mapped to like a single output.
I think this is a great way to structure code, by the way.
Yeah,
Like I think this, like if I was to, I'm a fan of MVVM. Basically what this is it's like an addition to MVVM. It's like
yeah,
adding state to MVVM. I'm a big fan of this. Like I think in my next course I won't do it, but probably all the ones following, I'm going to introduce this state thing that you're talking about. And so for those of you who aren't really following, I'll get a little bit more detailed about what he's saying, and he can correct me if I'm wrong.
sure.
So they have a couple state variables in their view model, and as you guys know, in the fragment or the activity, you can observe the view model. So say there's two. He said view state and an event state, right? So
Yeah,
they're observing those, and inside of those states, they have a whole bunch of fields. Like he said, is loading. They'll have like maybe some data holder class, maybe some other booleans for like other little logic. And then so in the activity or the fragment, they only have to observe those two things. So literally two observables will be observing the view state and the event state. And then those state classes change and the observable will trigger. And it's really cool because kind of like what you've done is you've pretty much taken out a whole bunch of if statements and switch statements, because that's what it would have been, really, because you'd have an event and then you'd say like, okay, if that event then change this boolean, but then you have like 20 of those, so it's kind of like either a big switch or a whole bunch of if statements. So what they've done is they've created this state class where you have all those things, and then if they change, the UI reacts. Instead of being like if change then do, it's like change react, and there's only like one thing that's being observed. And it's really, I love this. I think it's like, that's bueno. It's a
yeah.
beautiful thing.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. Like this was, like I said, it's kind of new. I mean, this isn't like a new approach by any means, but like we're kind of introducing this and really trying to codify and like solidify exactly,
Codify.
like we want to know exactly like how we want this to work. So there was a lot of back and forth on this, but now that like it's kind of in, I think we're both like really happy with how it worked out, for all the reasons you described. And then I like adding on to that too, like, you know, like you said, it works, you know, very MVVM in the sense that like you have that state exposed, and then now you're free to bind that state into your UI layer however you want, which like I think that's an interesting advantage too, because people a lot of times, you know, when you're talking about architecture, they want to know like, oh, should I be using view binding? Should I be using like butter knife, Kotlin synthetics, bind view by ID, like all these different choices, but like it all ultimately is the same thing. It's like, it really is almost independent of the actual like architecture if you do it cleanly, which I think like this is kind of like what we're getting with this. Like we can now bind this very easily, like directly using find view by ID, or we could use like cotter knife or butter knife, or we could use data binding and like put that view model then into the XML and the binding class. Like it doesn't really matter, which like I think that right there is really powerful because it really does give you that clean separation of the layers. And
Like,
even, go
so
ahead.
I was gonna say it's like buzzword independent. Like it doesn't
Yeah, yeah,
it doesn't matter what buzzword you want to throw in there. We're good.
yeah,
Use this kind of thing. It's funny because there's so
totally.
many things. Oh, should I use this? Should I use data binding? Should I use fragments? Should I use activities? Should I blah 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 blah? Doesn't matter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very much. Which, so even building on that, like an interesting aspect of this is like this same basic approach like is very viable for like a Kotlin multi-platform project potentially too. Like right now we're using, you know, like the Android view model stuff, but like you could basically do the same type of thing in a completely sort of framework independent way and have just like a pure Kotlin view model and have it be working with like coroutines, flow maybe, and basically do the same thing and expose, you know, your observable state. And then not only can you bind it independent of the buzzword, like you're saying data binding or butter knife or whatever, but like independent of the framework, even like Android, iOS, web.
It's so
Um,
clean. It's just
yeah,
it's so clean. Like you have the state class, whatever you design will tell it all. It'll tell you everything that's going to change, everything from the data to whatever's going to happen. Like it's I think that's a great way to structure code, and I'm definitely going to be starting to teach that because it's just like it checks all the boxes. Clean, unit testable, not it's very easy to read, it's easy to implement. It's almost platform independent, almost buzzword independent. It's just good.
yeah, yeah. I think those right there, I think like those are the types of questions that like people should be thinking about when like you're picking an architecture. I mean, like we said right off the top, right? Like there isn't like one correct architecture. It's just like how many of those boxes are you checking, you know, and is it solving your problem? Can you maintain it? Can you add to it in the long run without a lot of problems? And so like we've been talking about this very sort of MVVM type approach is very reactive and whatnot. But if you have an approach that's MVI or MVP or whatever that checks all those boxes, then go with it. Like
Yeah, exactly.
it doesn't matter so much. I mean, ultimately we just want to ship software that works. So
And it doesn't suck to maintain.
yeah. Well, and that's a huge one too, is like it's like getting something to work once is one thing, but like then being able to add to it like 3 or 4 sprints in a row and just like continually update it without having to totally refactor your code every time, like that's where the real wins come. And that's where like the wins from testing and stuff come too. Like in the process of this PR I was working on, like I wrote some tests kind of in the middle, and then as I continued to refactor, like there were some changes where I was like really expecting, like I thought, oh, maybe things are going to break, or is this logic quite right still? But like having the tests in place lets you refactor very confidently. And like sometimes that means like that, yeah, the test failed. They're like, okay, good. Like I expected it to fail and it actually did. Like that's a good thing. It means the test is valuable. Um,
It's doing what
but
it's supposed to.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, I want to talk about. Do you want? I don't want you to tell me like actual numbers, but like, if you could give me like percentage wise, what kind of pay do people accept when they compare like remote work as opposed to getting jobs at companies in general? You don't have to like not
No.
necessarily big companies, just like remote work in general, remote work to general software dev jobs.
Um, that's a really good question. I don't honestly, I don't know. And I think part of that is just like companies that are like fully remote and that are out there sort of like promoting remote work and stuff. There's just not as many of them. They kind of tend to fall into sort of like two camps, I guess. One being that they basically pay the same as like, let's say Silicon Valley or some other like, target market. They'll pay people the same as that market, regardless of where they live. So that's kind of how like my company is working. They basically decided, this is what we value this position at. We don't care if you're in Silicon Valley or the middle of nowhere with a really low cost of living. Like if we value the work in this way, we'll pay someone to do it no matter what. Then there's sort of another school of thought that does adjust that pay depending on the cost of living. And like like Buffer, the company, they're an example of this, and they're very upfront. Like they publish their whole sort of like formula for how they calculate it. In fact, I'm pretty sure even their employees' salaries are public. Like I think you can go in and actually see what people are making
I think
in
that's a good
different
way to do it.
cities. Yeah, like I think the transparency is great. Like I don't really have a strong preference either way. Like I can see the pros and cons. I think the transparency about it is really important to me though. Like if you have a good rationale for why you're doing it and it's in alignment with like the values of your company or whatever, then I think I'm okay with that. That said, like I think you can find remote jobs where you don't have to take a huge pay cut. Like I don't feel like I've had to take any kind of huge pay cut because I'm remote. For me and the few jobs that I've had and for, some of the other offers that I've, considered, the bigger differentiator in pay for me has been more of just like the style of company than like whether it's remote or on site. So, bigger companies, more of the name brand companies just tend to pay a lot more. Whereas, like startups, unless it's, getting ready to sort of go public or it's a pretty, well-established startup, they're going to probably pay you a bit less. And the fact that, some of those are remote and some aren't, I don't think probably pay quite as much into that. That said, like I think there's probably a strong correlation between the size of company and how willing to do like remote work they are. I mean, like for me, the companies that I know of that are out there allowing remote work and really like promoting it and I think adopting it well, they tend to be smaller, more established, like slower growing places. Maybe not slower growing, but just like smaller, able to like experiment a little bit more. So like it's probably related a little bit in that sense.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's any like straightforward answer there. It's just, whatever they're willing to pay you, the kind of thing. Doesn't, yeah. I mean, I've never had a
Yeah.
remote job, but I browse jobs and it doesn't seem to me that remote jobs necessarily pay less. Like from what I've seen, a lot of them seem more open, I would say too. Like there's a lot of jobs out there that are very, you can tell like they're being misleading or they're vague in their application.
Yeah.
And then like, more often than not, a remote job seems more open. Like they'll be like, this is what we're going to pay. This is what we expect. It's very like straightforward, like no BS kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely my experience, I think, with with Udacity, but like very much so with my new company PixSite. And I kind of wonder, like, is that just a byproduct of like being remote? Because like I think to be a remote first company, like you do have to just be more open and transparent. And so maybe like that's just like a byproduct that you're also seeing in how they advertise for a position.
Yeah, I could be just like we were talking about, like the mentality, the mentality of the people at the company, the mentality of the higher ups at the company. Like there are people who, if you're willing to hire a remote worker, it means you're willing to trust people. If you're not willing to hire a remote worker, it implies that you don't trust people. You know,
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah, that trust component is huge. Like if you can't trust your employees to be working to deliver what they've agreed upon, remote's just not going to work.
no. So how much time do you got left, by the way? Because we've been on here for over an hour now. I don't want to keep you too long if you're busy.
No, I don't have anything pressing.
Okay, great. Because I got more questions.
Cool. Let's go.
Usually actually I hit the live chat right now, but most of my audience is from India, like a lot of the audience, and it's like 6 in the morning, I think, India right now. So this isn't necessarily the best. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions in the comments after because they'll watch it tomorrow. But so I mean, we could go through the chat really quickly and just see if we can pick anything out. But a lot of people have already left, and the people who asked the question. Well, here, I'll just say to the chat right now, if you have any questions, ask, and from now on I will go through them, but for those of you who are actually listening. But other than that, I'm not going to be, because there's just not enough people in here. So let's I want to ask you about, what do you think about the current state of Android development? Because you've been around for a while. I'm pretty new around here. Like I just started programming, 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, maybe 4. And so I don't know a lot. I don't have a lot to say other than I can notice the documentation has significantly improved. But other than that, I just don't have a lot to say because I wasn't around. So what do you have to say about the current state of development and the documentation, kind of all that stuff?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not perfect yet. I think that I don't think there's never been a better time, I would say, to like be an Android developer. I mean, just the quality and the number of tools that are available to us these days, the improvements in the documentation and the stronger recommendations from Google on some of this stuff have made a huge difference. Having Kotlin and starting to just see what's possible with that, I think has helped a lot. And I feel like a lot of this stuff now, like Kotlin, architecture components, Jetpack, all this stuff that's like been pretty new and shiny now for a couple of years, I think is getting pretty, stable and mature. And, I feel like these days, if you're going to start out and build a new like greenfield app, it'd be so much nicer doing it today than it was 2 or 3 years ago. Just because a lot of those common use cases are just so much easier to deal with today. That said, like I mentioned, it's not perfect by any means. Like I think there's still a lot of improvement that can be done in terms of like how all this new stuff is being sort of promoted to the public or positioned like for release. Like I know they addressed this at I/O, but like the fact that everything stays in like alpha forever seemingly really isn't helping the adoption of this stuff. And like it's really confusing because they talk about like alphas and betas, which are like really stable and all that, and yet once you've been bitten in production by a buggy alpha, like it's really hard to want to take a chance on another alpha, even if they're saying like, oh yeah, this is a stable alpha. Like it's just really hard to do that. But when stuff just like stays in alpha forever and then finally jumps to like a stable and then is immediately an alpha again, it's hard to like know where to find that.
Yeah. So I think you said something like, you hit the nail on one of them there. Like I love everything that's happening. Like Jetpack in general. I'm in love with Jetpack. I just love so many things about it. It's improved Android development vastly, and like the way things work together. just like so much better than it was. But I mean, I had some bad experiences because I was just starting, you know, and I didn't know a lot like 3, 4 years ago. So it was really hard. So Jetpack to me is like sent from God. It's like, it's just beautiful. But there's a negative, like, and you outlined it. There's so much stuff. It's like, what architecture do I learn? Do I use navigation components? Do I use fragments? Do I use activities? Do I, you know, it's just like, there's 100 questions like that.
Yeah.
And the documentation does uh almost, I mean, they try to funnel you a bit into what they think is the best way, but not much. Like, it's mostly just like the Wild West, and you're like, oh. And for like guys like you or me, that's no big deal. Like, we can look at it, get our hands on it, and figure out pretty quickly what's going to work or what we like and what we don't like. But for people who are just starting, that's got to be so overwhelming.
Yeah.
Like there's now there's there's 3 different languages, like
Totally.
Kotlin, Java, Flutter, and there's different architectures. There's like, do I
Oh
use
yeah.
different dependency injection stuff? Do I need to know dependency injection? Different ways to use unit testing, different, like, it's just like, what do I do? I can very easily see people very quickly going into a panic and seeing like, just like, what the hell do I do, kind of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, I think that's always been one of those biggest, it's like one of the best and worst things about Android, right? Is like, you know, like while they're taking, like Google's taking stronger stances these days, they have their opinions. There's still like many, many ways to do anything. And so like you said, dependency injection. I mean, there's been so many conversations about dependency injection going around lately. And like if you already kind of know what's going on, you have an idea around what works for your projects and whatnot, you can kind of look at those, laugh, cry, get angry, like whatever you want, but like it's not that big a deal. But if you're just coming in and you start seeing like people having like arguments, like in really heated discussions and all that, about that, it's very intimidating. It's hard to know what you're using. If you chose one thing over the other and like you see someone bashing it, suddenly like you feel like you're wrong. And so like just navigating all of those different questions and comparisons and all that stuff, I think is still so difficult. And I don't know that like there's a good answer for that, because there's always going to be all of those different options. Like, I think that's where, you know, a lot of times people try and ask questions like, what's the best architecture? What's the best dependency injection? All that. I think sometimes like the more useful discussion to have is just in like, you know, learning to evaluate things sort of fairly and objectively, and just being able to pick out, you know, the pros and cons of something and realizing that there isn't a best. But that's really hard to do when you're just starting out.
Yep.
And I think these days it's also like you mentioned Flutter, like, you know, the state of Android today, like while it's really nice and mature, like mature could also be bad in a sense of like it's a little bit long in the tooth, and like it has grown probably far beyond what like they initially thought. And we saw that like at I/O, they're talking about the UI framework and how like the initial like the size and pixels of like the initial test device screen is like the same size as an icon on like a Pixel 3 or something. Like just like they designed Android for such a completely different like hardware and software ecosystem. And like that's where you see a lot of these pain points. And so then you have someone that's coming in and they see, you know, like people complain about how hard Android is, but then you see Flutter and like people are talking about how amazing Flutter is. But Flutter, you know, has like its own use cases. And then you have stuff like React Native and Kotlin multi-platform. Like, I feel like in a lot of ways, the platforms are converging in terms of like patterns and, you know, styles of programming and all that. But then it just makes it that much more confusing to pick one. Like, should you learn native? Should you learn Flutter, React Native, Kotlin multi-platform? Like all of this stuff just becomes that much more complicated as these platforms seem to just get more and more similar.
Yeah, there's definitely like similarities. Like one thing that comes to mind for sure is like this, just the reactivity in general, like this observable observer thing, like that is kind of universal. So like just knowing about that in terms of architecture and how you design your applications is definitely going to help you, because no matter what you go to, that seems to be the way to do things. And I definitely like programming that way. That's for sure.
Yeah, totally. I'm really curious, like what Android is going to look like, let's say like 2, 3, 4 years from now. Because I really do wonder, like, if Google's going to slowly start talking more and more about Fuchsia, especially now that like they have their website up for that. And if you're going to just sort of like continue to see like Flutter and Android live side by side and maybe become more and more similar. And then at some point, they're just going to funnel everybody with like these common set of skills into the new OS, which like, honestly, at that point, they would probably just basically be Flutter, because I think like Dart is supported natively with Fuchsia. But like, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if like, and we're not talking about Android, in a few years, just because like, as software goes, like it's been around 10 years now. Like that's a long time to be doing the same thing. And we don't do it the same way anymore, but it's still, getting pretty old. So, I wouldn't be surprised if they're looking to shake that up.
So you're a Flutter guy. You think Flutter is going to be the thing after, however many years?
I don't know. Like I don't know that I'm a Flutter guy. I mean, I don't really use Flutter. I've played with it a little bit. I think it's really interesting technology. I also just like I'm curious like why Google is promoting it so heavily. And like one of the scenarios I can see for why they're promoting it so heavily is because like maybe they have plans for Fuchsia, and that like Flutter is sort of their way of starting to upskill developers towards developing with Fuchsia. Because like I said, I think Fuchsia supports Dart. Its whole point is to be very like cross-platform, like an operating system from everything from like an IoT device to a mobile to TV to desktop, everything, which like that's basically Flutter's whole thing as well, is like that really portable cross-platform thing. And if you're thinking about how to like make software to run on all of those different things, like it kind of makes sense. So I could see Google like making that pitch, especially in the absence of any other like discernible business model for them. Like they're funneling tons and tons of resources into Flutter. You'd think that there has to be a reason why.
Yeah.
Granted, it's Google and they like to just try things and then throw them away. So who knows, like 6 months from now, they could be completely abandoning Flutter. And I wouldn't be surprised, but I also wouldn't be surprised to see if like, that's more of an indicator of where like they're hoping to go.
Yeah, when I was talking to Vasily on one of my podcasts, he was talking about his conspiracy theory, and he was thinking, he's like, yeah, because apparently Google is like entangled in a lawsuit that's been going on forever with Oracle because of Java, and he thinks that this is their play to get away from Java. Like if shit hits the fan and they can't use Java anymore, then they can just say, okay, well, we got Fuchsia and Flutter, so who cares?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
I remember listening to that and thinking very much that like what he was describing tracked very closely with some of the stuff I had been thinking. I hadn't thought as much about the lawsuit aspect of it, but of just like having that almost like backup plan kind of thing in place.
Right. Where like, there's already a whole bunch of developers on it. It makes sense. Like it makes sense from a company perspective. If like I said, shit hits the fan and they got to let go of Java for whatever reason, or it becomes too expensive to stay entangled with it, then they can just say, oh, well, Flutter it is. And then they have all the control.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes sense too. Like if you're thinking about launching a new operating system, like, when iOS and Android kicked off, like the whole like mobile thing was totally new. So people were more used to sort of being locked into like, Windows or Mac or like these fewer like set platforms. But like they're trying to like launch a new mobile ecosystem and have it run like everywhere. Like they're going to need people to be able to like jump in and do that immediately, because they're going to have like a good value proposition for companies to want to invest in that versus what they're already doing. So if they have a bunch of people that already have these very similar skills from, say, Flutter, and then they can immediately jump over into like Fuchsia, suddenly now like it's not so crazy to jump on that new operating system.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I don't know.
makes
We'll
sense.
see. It's gonna be interesting. I was honestly like, Fuchsia has been such a like almost vaporware thing. Like there's hints of it here and there, but like it was hard to get a lot of like concrete details. I was surprised they finally like launched the website recently and talk about it and all that. I was surprised I didn't hear more about it at I/O with that website dropping so quickly. So I'm hoping maybe like next year's I/O we get some information about that. We'll
Yeah,
see.
who knows? It's
Yeah,
all a mystery.
yeah,
We got
it's
some
Google, right?
Yeah, we got some questions here now that after I said that. So let's take a look here.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know where they began actually. Probably okay. Do you think getting a job in mobile development is harder today or more difficult because of competition?
Um, I don't think it's more difficult. Like, I mean, there's definitely more competition, but there's also like there's so many jobs out there, and it's also really easy these days, I think, to sort of develop like your not just your resume, but like your portfolio, like your online presence, like literally your portfolio, putting apps in the app store. So I think like that, in just combination with just how many jobs are out there, and the fact that like you literally can put an app in the store yourself, um, and start trying to make money that way. Like I think it's still very like viable these days to get a job, because like I said, there's more competition these days. But 6 years ago, not every single company out there was jumping on the mobile train. Whereas these days, like having a mobile app is just almost table stakes for a company that's trying to make a name for themselves. So
Yeah, so harder, but more competition, but more opportunity is.
yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. Anyway, just it seems like there's endless jobs. It seems like out there. Like type in software developer into any
Yeah,
your job search platform of your choice, and there's like tons of jobs. So
yeah,
it's getting the experience and getting noticed by those companies is the tricky part. So actually, yeah, that's a nice segue. What do you think is the best way for people to get these jobs? Other than putting apps in the app store, which you've already talked about, what do you think they can do to help their chances of getting hired at these places?
yeah. That's an awesome question. I think it's a combination of things. I mean, like very honestly, who makes a really big difference. Like, and not necessarily that like you have to know a certain person, but just knowing people in general in the industry, knowing where to look for jobs. Like, there's such a big difference between like just going on LinkedIn, for example, and typing Android job and just like sifting through the 50,000 results that come back, or however crazy many results, versus like someone whose company is hiring, or you're in a Slack community or Discord or something, and someone in there is posting. So just having like some type of public presence, whether that's Reddit, Twitter, Slack, YouTube, like wherever it is, like, and just being involved in conversations, I think is a really powerful way, and it's a really like simple way of putting your name out there, which is a huge part of the battle. And then once you have a lead on a job, you know, most places are still going to want a resume of some kind. And I think like if you can put on your resume, like, here are one or two projects that I've done, don't even have to be in the Play Store. Like literally could just be something on your GitHub, something to point to that you can explain well when you are in a phone screen or like a technical phone interview. That makes such a big difference. Like when I've screened candidates and stuff for jobs, if someone can point me to like their GitHub and I can see a code example, and then we talk about it for 10 or 15 minutes, and they clearly know like the code, they didn't just copy and paste it, but like they understand why they did everything. That makes such a huge difference, in terms of like setting yourself apart. And again, I think that's something like, it's not that challenging. Like that's much more approachable, I feel like, than saying like, oh, you need to memorize cracking the coding interview to be able to get a good job. And so I think like encouraging people to like have that work and then to polish it too. Like that's another thing I've seen, like someone has a nice project, but like the code is maybe kind of messy, or like they don't have a README. Like even small things like that, I think can be really, really useful. And I think like the last thing, I know like Don has talked about this many times. I talk about it too, but just like, you know, like again, kind of having your name out there, being involved in the community, you know, blogging, speaking, anything that just like shows, that demonstrates you know what you're doing, even if that's like, here's this bug I fixed, here is this, you know, line in the documentation that helped me solve this problem, kind of back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Anything like that helps. I think it helps in multiple ways. Like again, just getting your name out there, demonstrating the stuff. You know, a recruiter might come across like a LinkedIn post to a blog article or something that you had. Like all of these things, I think over time will lead to you like having a much easier time finding a job. And I think too, just one last thing, it helps to kind of keep it in perspective a bit too. Like when you're first starting off, like it is really challenging, like because you don't have a lot of this, you don't have all the time invested in it. So it does take a bit longer. But once you have a little bit of experience, like it does get easier. And then eventually you might find yourself with like the opposite problem where like you're annoyed at, you know, recruiters like spamming you all the time. So I think just like having that perspective can help too.
So you were part of job filtering processes.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of hiring. You know,
So
I've never.
tell us about that.
Um, yeah, so I can talk just a little bit about like what I look for, which obviously
Yeah.
this is going to be different depending on what company you're at and all of that. But I really dislike sort of like, you know, the FANG company traditional interview process of, you know, trivia questions and all that kind of stuff. So I tend to skew the other direction. When I've interviewed people, I really like to just get a sense of like, do they know whatever it is they're planning to do? So for me, mostly I've been interviewing people for Android positions. So do you know Android? Like, how would you actually build this? And that could be stuff like from literally how would you respond to a click up to how would you download something? How would you structure your app? How would you build this UI? Very practical things that would actually come up during a day to day. And a lot of times like this has taken different forms. Like I tried to experiment a bit while I was at Udacity, just in terms of like different types of questions and stuff I would ask. So, you know, I've done things like a code review portion of an interview, which I really like to try and gauge how you can communicate about code, you know, talk about decisions you made. That's another reason why I encourage people to like, if you have a project on your GitHub, be able to explain it thoroughly, because people might ask you about it. In which case, like if you know it well, then it changes it from being like a stressful interview to thinking, oh, this is a cakewalk. I also like to still ask like an interview or a coding question. I know that, you know, a lot of people don't like, you know, the traditional like tricky gotcha type data structures and algorithms coding questions, but I think there's still value in like very straightforward coding questions that kind of replicate the type of stuff you do. So I would oftentimes ask a question of just how you would like basically take a list of data and like transform it into some other object and then like print it out to the screen. So like if you're doing this with Kotlin, that's like 1 or 2 lines of code, but there's multiple types of like edge cases of like, you know, checking for a null input list, checking for null items, like stuff that actually comes up in the day to day, not just like, do you know this one random method on, you know, the red black tree or something like that.
Yeah.
So I think like, you know, the interviewing process in general is a bit broken in the industry in a lot of ways and is really stressful. And so obviously like, you know, good advice is to study, but beyond studying, I think also just like recognizing what you have control over and like coming to terms with the fact that like you might not know all the algorithms, but if you aren't super comfortable with a certain algorithm a day or two before an interview, like you might be better served to brush up on like, oh, how do I talk about my code? Can I sit down and clearly communicate how I'm walking through writing out a method? Do I know how to check for like null values correctly, inputs and outputs? All of that stuff I think is really, really important in the process, and oftentimes gets overshadowed by people worried so much about the algorithm. And I think it makes sense because like, again, when we're focused on like the big companies, that's what they look for.
Yeah.
But at smaller companies, I think there is a trend towards a different style of interview. Like a lot of my interviews over the last several years have trended away from that style of interview. Like, I mean, actually, for example, my interview for PicSite, my current job, like we had like a couple phone conversations just talking about a bunch of different topics in the Android world. And then I had like a take-home project which was like a 5-hour thing where I basically wrote some code, a very small self-contained thing. And then we had a follow-up interview where we reviewed that code together and did some pair programming. And to me, that's probably been like by far my most enjoyable interview experience.
I think that's the best way to do it. And take home projects personally. Like when I was talking to Aiden, when he applied at Square, he said that he got a take home project. He did the thing that they asked. He sent it in. They did a code review on it. And I've applied for a few jobs too to see what their interview process is like. And some I've noticed do that. So I mean, I think that's a way better way, because you're given a task. You get 24 hours to complete the task. You submit the task on GitHub. The guy reviews it. You go through it together. Why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? What could you have done better? Blah 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 blah. That seems like a better way to do things to me.
Yeah, I like I said, I really like it. I think there are better ways, like good and bad ways to do it, because it does sort of lend itself to people with more free time on their hands.
Yeah, that's
especially
true.
in a case where like they're like, here's the project you have, we'll give you 48 hours. Like you have until 2 days from now to complete this. Like that's a really tough sell for some people, or like just people that don't have a lot of like vacation time and can't afford to like take a day off to do this thing. Like that's a tough sell too. So like, I don't think it's the perfect option in all scenarios, but like I said, I think there's ways to even make it better. Like I think for the one I just did, I actually had several take homes for different companies I was interviewing with, and a couple did it better than others. And the ones that were doing it best, you had like a week or something to complete it. And it was just kind of like on the honor system of like, yeah, try and, take no more than like 5 hours on this. But, if it's a little bit more or less, like that's fine. PicSite, my current company, they actually paid me for my time, which I think like that's a huge one. Especially if you're a company that's like claiming to really value like work-life balance and just like your employees having time for their family and everything. Like if you're asking them to take essentially a day from their life to like work on this for you, I think paying them for that actually like is really like, it makes it much more possible for people to do it, but also just shows that like you're actually like operating in alignment with your values.
Was there criteria for if you could apply for this job? Because obviously they can't just go around paying everybody who applies, right?
Yeah, no. So this was so the take home was like the second or third kind of round of this. So that was another thing where I do think it works better in that flow, because yeah, you're right. You couldn't just like pay everybody if that was like the filter, which I've been at places where that is how it works. Like basically they just like email you a project right off the bat. And then depending on how you do on that, then you proceed to other rounds. And in that scenario, yeah, you wouldn't be able to pay. I've also had a case where I submitted code that didn't work and still passed the like take home, which made me question like why they were even doing it. And they mentioned even that like they were shipping out the sort of evaluation of the code to a third party. So they weren't even looking at the code themselves, which like that to me was actually a big red flag. Like the fact
Yeah,
that
that's weird.
they accepted my code made me not trust them.
Yeah, that's
Which,
strange.
yeah. So yeah, so I don't know. Again, I don't think there's a perfect answer to this. Like, how do you interview effectively? But I think what's been the status quo now for quite a while is pretty clearly not the correct answer. So I'm happy to see companies like experimenting with different methodologies.
I agree. I agree with that. You know, there's not really a clear answer, but I also think that the current way that big companies interview is bullshit. Like
Yeah.
the algorithm questions, the tricky algorithm questions. Like, what the hell are you interviewing for? Like, really? I don't understand that. Like, I don't know, again, because I haven't worked there. So again, I'm very biased. But to me, logistically, that makes zero sense. You might get a bunch of people who have high IQs. That will probably be the result. But it doesn't mean that they know how to code. It doesn't know that they know how to build things. I don't, and that's what they're doing. So I mean, I don't know. That seems strange to me. But
Yeah.
again, I'm biased.
I have the same bias once again. I mean, I've gone through interview loops with some of those big companies before where, you know, I'm interviewing for an Android position. We spend 6 hours together and we spend 10 minutes of it talking about Android. Like that just, it strikes me as really odd. So
Yeah. So I want to kind of finish up here. So I have a couple of questions for you, which oh yeah, I was gonna say I forgot them, but I just found them. So it's actually questions about your YouTube channel.
okay.
So why did you start a YouTube channel? What made you decide to start one?
It's a good question. Again, I kind of stumbled into it. I think I was just, I had been reading like some different books just about, you know, a little bit, you know, like boosting your public like profile a little bit. I was at the same time I was trying to just like be more active in the community. Like at that time I hadn't really done any like speaking within the Android community yet, and I like just barely started like interacting on Twitter. So I was just trying to like get more involved. And um, I think like my first video had nothing to do with Android. I don't know why. Just like like a tweet I saw caught my eye and it made me want to like just like film a response. And then once I did that, I was like, oh well, now suddenly I know some tools. And so I just started like, oh well, maybe I'll just try like playing with some of this stuff. Like mostly that was how it started. I just like wanted to play around with like video editing and like videography and stuff. And Android was like something I like to talk about and feel like I could jump in and talk about. So that ended up being what I recorded. And then it just kind of like evolved from there into a way to like try and provide some of that like mentorship that I was seeing people missing out on. Like I was hosting small meetups at the time for Udacity students. And I was just like seeing all these challenges, like literally people that you know, lost their entire month's worth of work because they were working on this course and it had never mentioned like source control. And so like they didn't have a backup of their project. And so I was just like looking for ways of like, how could I try and like help answer some of these questions? Like if we were just gonna like if I was gonna sit down with like a new developer and like try and give them the advice, like what would we talk about? And so that's what I've been trying to do basically. And yeah.
So I have a question for you, like
Yeah.
a question from YouTuber to YouTuber. How do you get those little hashtags above your title in your description? I don't know how to do that. I see a bunch of people doing it and I don't know how it's done.
I think you just have to add the hashtags in the description. I don't know. I'm not doing any, like, I don't even know. Like, if
Because I looked at one of your videos today just before we did this, and I noticed this, and I thought, what the hell? How do you do that? And
it's definitely not something that, like, I'm specifically, like, putting them there. So if they're there, I think they're either, like, recognizing from, like, the tags and they're
oh,
adding them there, or it's actually, like, the hashtag that was in the description.
okay. So you don't know. I'll take a look. I'll see if I can
I
figure it out.
think I think it's like if you put a hashtag in the description of the video, I think it will display it.
Okay. I mean, that would make sense, I think, because that's probably the only thing that I haven't done.
Yeah, I think that's it. But yeah, it's kind of confusing because I just started like seeing that too and like had no idea where that feature popped up.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna try it because I thought it was cool.
Yeah.
And then my last question, actually, I want to ask you two questions. First one is, do you make your own thumbnails? Because I think they're really good. Your thumbnails are great.
I do make them. Um, Sometimes so I use Canva for my thumbnails. And so sometimes I'll start with like a template, and maybe just like, swap out the image. Or sometimes I'll do it from scratch. Like I kind of said, like for me, like YouTube is very much like a creative outlet as much as anything else. And so like I like to dabble with design. So like thumbnails is a way to play with that. Yeah, I'm glad to hear someone likes them. I mean,
I think they're awesome. They're really good, I think.
I know, I remember recently, as we're sharing compliments, I really liked your thumbnails for like one of your like recent series of like Dagger videos.
Oh yeah, I love
They
that
were,
one
they were
too.
like really clean and had like a nice looking material palette to it. But yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's kind of fun to have. I don't know. There's like so many aspects that can go into like creating content. I mean, like you know it even better than I do. You've been doing it longer, and you do it really, really well. But like to to put something out versus like put something out that's like really polished and has the thumbnails and it has graphics and animations and all that. Like there's like infinite possibilities for like creativity. So even like filming a 3-minute video on like a really simple topic, there's so many ways to go about that.
Yeah, definitely in editing. Def for sure
Yeah,
in editing. Like I hate editing. Like I wish I could force myself to spend more time editing, like doing the thing that Florian does where he like clips the code, makes it big,
yeah,
but it just takes so much time and like I like to create. I don't really like to like edit and like push stuff out there. It's just kind of like I mean I like it, but like I like to just build things. And so like I'm
yeah,
always just like okay, video, post them all. Okay, next thing. I don't know. That's just how I am. Probably in the future I'll end up hiring somebody to do these things that I don't like to do, but I don't make enough money to do that yet. So in
yeah.
time.
I hear you. Like, there's only so many hours, right? So
Yeah.
if it's the difference between like that little extra bit of like editing tricks or polish versus like being able to like put out another useful video, like you kind of run into diminishing returns there.
Yeah. I don't know because especially with the clipping code thing and zooming up,
But
uh
that, yeah, it depends on what you're doing. Like,
yeah, for sure. Like that seems pretty like that would be a good idea to do, no matter how long
yeah,
it takes, because then people could watch on phones.
yeah.
So
That's
anyway.
what I always appreciate Florian's videos because like I actually watch most of my YouTube stuff on my phone. I think like he actually put out a post once where he took a poll to see where people are watching, and I was like one of the few people in like the 5% of viewers that were watching on their phone. But like I appreciate that about his videos because like you can watch them on a small screen.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
it's pretty cool. So the last question, unless there's some questions in the chat, looks like there's a couple, but the last question I personally want to ask you is, what do you think about Firebase? Would you use Firebase? Like if you got hired as a freelancer or you got a contract for the company that you worked on and you had to implement something, would you use Firebase or would you sooner put up your own server, build a REST API, that kind of thing? Would you go that route or Firebase? What are your thoughts there?
um like right today I would use Firebase just because my experience. Well, two reasons. I have experience with Firebase. Like I've actually used Firebase in production on multiple projects. So like I understand how it works. And I feel like it scales quite well up to a good point. And I feel like once you reach the point where maybe it's not scaling, like that's a really good position to be in. And you can cross that bridge when you come to it. And then the second reason is like my skills in terms of like being able to put up my own like back end, they're just not that strong yet. That's actually like on my to-do list. I've been playing around recently with some of that stuff. And so that's where I'm at today. But like I know I've seen some people say that like they would never like build an app with Firebase in production, and I've always like very much disagreed with that. So I don't know. I love Firebase in general. I feel like it's one of the best things we've gotten in the last several years out of Google because it makes developers' lives so easy. Like you really can, like a single person doesn't have to think about how to build their back end. Like if they don't have that skill yet, that doesn't have to be a limiting factor for them in building an app and scaling it up. And the fact that like it's cross-platform too, and you can use that on iOS, Android, Flutter, the web, like it really like I feel like it does a great job for that type of scenario.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing platform, I guess you'd call it. I really do. A lot of their tools are like really incredible, and they, you know, from crash reporting to the database to authentication, push notifications, all that stuff. Everything's like it honestly is incredible. But I also see the other side of the argument where you know you don't own the data, and it's very hard, and it's very hard to get the data off of there. Like I looked into it one time just to see, you know, what it would take to get my Firestore data stored somewhere other than on Firebase. And it wasn't an easy process. It was like it was a very difficult process actually. And so there's one thing there that I would say, you know, not owning your data is a big deal, especially if you're planning on building an app that has a lot of users. But I think for beginners, Firebase is like awesome, like it, or in like beginner, intermediate level, because you don't have to worry about all the other stuff. You just focus on the thing you want to build and let Firebase handle the rest, which it does an awesome job at. But yeah, like I said, the other end is you don't own the data. And also there's a few things about Firestore I don't like why is there no like query? Like why is there no way to make an SQL like query? That blows my mind. Like just that one thing, like they have all these advanced tools and you can't do an SQL like query. Like what the hell?
Yeah, there's some weird quirks like that too. And like, I mean, before when it was just the real-time database, like, you know, it's pretty like you could do a lot with it, but then there's also like you couldn't do like really efficient searching for certain types of things, and so there are definitely limitations. Another thing, your point about not owning your data is a really good one, especially like if you're thinking about like GDPR and stuff, which like if you're trying to do business like in Europe, where you think about that, like that's like something to take into account. Which like honestly, in some ways, it's both like a pro and a con of like Firebase. So like you said, you don't really owe the data, but they also do like provide mechanisms for like GDPR compliance. Whereas if you're doing it yourself, it's all on you from a legal and engineering standpoint. But in practical sense, if you're just like starting out as like a solo person, no one's probably going to come after you unless you're like scamming someone, in which case you're bringing it on yourself anyways. So
yeah,
but
at the end of the day, Firebase is awesome, especially for beginners. It's an awesome tool. So that was all the questions I want to ask you, but there's a couple questions in here in the chat if you don't mind, just kind of finishing up here. What would your advice be to someone aspiring to start a YouTube channel on Android programming?
First thought is just start. And I think that's like the number one thing is just grab your camera, grab some screen recording software, like whatever it is, and just record something and start talking about it. And I think once you do that, once you start getting in some reps of like recording, editing, getting a video up, you know, all the rest of it, you can kind of learn a little bit at a time, you know, learn one editing trick at a time, upgrade gear as you go. Like, I mean, I think that's one advantage of doing like software related stuff is like a lot of this video becomes just screen recording. So you don't need like a fancy camera, which, you know, a lot of people, that's their first thought of wanting to go upgrade, mine included. But yeah, just start and then share it out, like, you know, chat with other YouTubers, you know, on Twitter, Instagram, let people know about it. I think that's been like the biggest thing for me is just like trying to stay consistent and just like keep putting stuff out and try to get a little bit better whenever possible.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Just starting. Don't give a shit what other people think. I think that's like, because there's always that barrier, like, you know, putting something out there for whoever to see. You're always going to have that self-conscious feeling. You got to get rid of that self-conscious feeling. Just say fuck it and just put it out there, and you're going to improve over time. Like if I cringe when I look at my first videos. I can't watch them. If literally one somehow gets on my screen and I hear my voice, I'm like, ah, and I have to like close it. I can't even watch it. So everybody deals with that. I think you just got to get comfortable with that. And everybody has something to contribute.
Yeah.
Like if you know something, there's definitely people who don't know it as well as you. And you have some, and if you've learned something, you have something to share. You can help somebody learn that. Even share the things that you struggled with. You know, I don't know. There's always something to share, and somebody will listen.
Yeah, I've chatted with a couple people recently. They were like just getting into Android and were, talking about like, oh, I kind of want to start like a podcast or YouTube channel, but I'm worried that like no one would listen. And actually, for me, like I almost find that more interesting. Like I'd love to just like have like a vlog or just like like a very regular thing of like someone learning for the first time and being like, today I learned how to like hook up a button, and like it like that sounds simple, but these were all the reasons why I found it complicated. Like I actually think that'd be super useful and interesting.
Yeah, like even for me too, like as a educator, like
Yeah,
just to hear about the things that they struggle with, like hearing their exact thought process as they went through this problem, because it helps me, because now I can think, oh, okay, this is something that people struggle with, so I can spend some more time on that, or think of a different example, or
yeah,
whatever.
absolutely.
Um, all right. Another question. Do you need any type of degree to take my courses? No, you don't. I design these things so that you don't have to go to school. That's the point. I think school is incredibly overpriced, especially in the U.S. and Canada. I don't know about other places, but I make these courses so that you can get a university level education or better, or I have master's students come up to me all the time. They ask me, hey, I'm following your course for my master's thesis, I think you call them. I'm doing this. Can you help me? So like you're getting a university master level education for $30 a month. This is insane. Just so you people know, like this is great, and you don't even have to pay. Like really, you could go on YouTube and look at my GitHub if you really wanted to. And same with Nate. I mean, he has great stuff too. You have a new course on free code camp, right?
Yeah. Came out last Friday. Yeah, like 2.5 hours on Kotlin. And I mean, like Free Code Camp is awesome. Like I hadn't looked through their backlog in a long time, but like they have everything there. You really can. Like these days, you can find really high quality stuff online for free or for a tiny fraction of what like a university education costs.
Yes. So Nate, thanks for coming on. Do you have anything other than your free code camp course that you want to talk about, that you want to tell the audience to go check out? Anything at all?
No, I mean, check out the YouTube channel. I'm happy to, chat with people there and to get, ideas or feedback on types of stuff they'd like to see. And I'm always available on like Twitter or Instagram if people have questions or want to chat. And if you happen to see me like out and about at a conference or something, say hi. I love to chat with people that like I've only interacted with from like YouTube or something, and actually like meet in real life. That's one of my favorite parts about doing any of this stuff. So
that would be cool. I'm yet to experience that. So that would be really cool. I'm looking forward to having that happen to me for the first time.
Did you Android Dev Summit registration just open? We could throw in a spot there. Maybe we'll run into each other.
Maybe. I'll give it a maybe. Probably not. I don't feel like I'm ready for the conference life. When I have something to say, I'll go to a conference.
Oh, I was just talking about attending, not even speaking.
No. I'm going to speak. If I go, I'm going to speak.
You should go to speak. You should. Yeah, we should talk. I'm wearing my DroidCon Boston shirt. I helped organize that one last year. We'd be happy to have you. I think you'd have a lot of interesting, unique perspective to share.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely on my list of things. It's like, yeah, it's getting up there for like need to do. So we should talk. Sure.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Cool. All of Nate's links are in the description to the video. Thank you again, Nate, for coming on my podcast, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
See you, everyone.